at Cornell, there was no professor of theory. There was no theory. The only thing that I had read in 1950 was Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, which was a book of fiction made into a movie with Gary Cooper. And I wanted to be like this architect in the book, a great designer. And so when I got out of the Army, I went to work for Walter Gropius in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I thought this was the pinnacle of where one could be. I soon realized that Walter Gropius and many other architects of name were no more than commercial architects. And it was not something spiritual or cultural that I wanted. So I went back to graduate school and I met and had dinner with the great English architect, young and unknown at the time, Jim Sterling. And I showed him a housing project that I was working on. And he said, you know, Peter, you're a really great designer. You're a really good designer, but you don't know anything about architecture. And I thought to myself, how can I be a good designer and not know anything about architecture? And I thought to myself, what does it mean I don't know anything about architecture? And so I went to Cambridge, England. I traveled with Colin Rowe. I did a dissertation, which I never expected to do. I never thought I was going to teach. I was going to be a designing architect, a big archistar. And what I realized at Cambridge and what Jim Sterling told me was that there were two sides to architecture. There was the design side and the theoretical side, let's say. And if you didn't have an idea, you were just making cartoons, bubbles. And so I realized the importance of ideas. I went on to teach. I've written books. I'm still teaching at Yale. I'm still practicing architecture. I'm doing three things that I think an architect should do. One is to think about architecture, to read. Number two, to build. Number three is to teach. And I like all three of those things. Jim Sterling also said to me at one time, he said, if you don't build, nobody will care about what you think. And that's also true. So there's a balance between thinking and doing. I want to go back to the 1970s and 1960s in the United States. The first book of theory that was written in the Western world, let's say in America in particular, was Bob Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction in 1966. It was a really important book because it talked about the need for history, the need for precedent in architecture, that you had to study certain buildings. And of course, I had traveled with Colin Rowe in Italy and seen a lot of these buildings. And Rowe, the first time I was in Italy, we were standing looking at a Palladian villa, and he said to me something again which animated my thinking. He said, I want you to stand and look at the facade until you can tell me something on that facade that you can't see. And I thought, what's that? Something I can't see I'm to tell you about? Anyway, I began solving those issues, and I wrote a dissertation which still animates my work today. After Venturi in 1966, there was a second book, this time with his wife, Denise Scott Brown, called Learning from Las Vegas. And this was completely different than Complexity and Contradiction, which was about the being of architecture. This was about the image of architecture and the meanings. And it was about what you could see in the Las Vegas Strip and buildings that looked like their meaning. A completely different idea. And then so in 72, I began to think differently, going back to my doctoral thesis, going back to lessons that I learned from Colin Rowe. And I started to work on other things. At the same time, in 1972, and this is the key 10 years, let's say, of my life, occurred between 72 and 82, let's say. Aldo Rossi, who is also a very famous architect, was asked to leave the university in Italy because he was a member of the Communist Party. And he was invited to Zurich by a man called Bernard Hörsli. And Hörsli asked Rossi to be a teacher. And he went from 1970 to 72. And he had an exhibition in 72 in Zurich. And my friend John Haydock, who was the dean at Cooper Union, also a very important influence on my work, said, we've got to bring Aldo Rossi to New York. And so this started a relationship, an international relationship of thinking between New York and Italy, and also in England. So there was really the first dialogue between countries. And Rossi had been put in charge of the Milan Triennale, one of the very famous exhibitions that happened every 3 years, very similar to the Venice Biennale, which happens every 2 years. And Rossi decided to invite 2 different groups of young architects to this Triennale. And it to me was the most important exhibition of the 70s. And it was called Rationalism. And it invited 2 groups, Radical Youth, which were like Super Studio and Archigram and Archizoom, the sort of radical urbanists, and the Rational Architects, which were the New York Five, young architects like Reinhardt and Reichland, etc. And these 2 groups were in this exhibition. And a magazine by the name of Controspazio, which means Against Space, edited by Ezio Bonfanti and Massimo Scolari, published an article called La Tendenza, the tendency. And La Tendenza set out for the next 5 or 6 years what a theoretical way of thinking that could be shared in New York, in London, and in Venice, in Milan. And La Tendenza was the tendency toward a rational architecture. It's really interesting. And then after the 73 exhibition, in 1976, Vittorio Gregotti, who is a very famous architect, Gregotti said, I want to have an international biennale, not a triennale, but a biennale. And it was actually the first architecture biennale, and it was called Europa America. In other words, a dialogue between what was happening in Europe and what was happening in the United States. And again, I was invited to select the American representation. And we had Bob Venturi, we had Charles Moore, Cesar Pelli, all the name people that you could imagine, Bob Stern, Stanley Tigerman, for the American side. And then the European side, there was Hans Hollein and Sterling and Smith and Moneo and Rossi, Imonino, Cardella, the names that if you don't know them, you should know them. In any case, they were known to all of us. And there was this dialogue, Europa America, which was really interesting. And all the architects got together 11 from Europe and 11 from the United States in this exhibition, really the first architectural biennale in 1976. That's the second exhibition. In 1978, there was an exhibition in Italy called Roma Interrotta, Rome Interrupted. And what it was a way of looking at the city of Rome by 12 different architects who could be said to be postmodern, that is, opposed to the rationalists, opposed to the radicals. A third group, which came out of learning from Las Vegas, was Roma Interrotta. And that was in 1978. Also in 78, as a counter reaction to that, and you have to understand that most of the theoretical work that was developed in the West happened in these 10 years in the 70s, and it happened because people didn't have much work to build. We were working on exhibitions and ideas. And so we met in Venice. We were invited to Venice, myself and Rafael Moneo, Aldo Rossi, etc., to John Haydock, Raymond Abraham. There was 10 architects. It was called 10 Projects for Canareccio. And that was in response to Roma Interrotta, so the rationalist architects against the postmodern architects. And there was always in the 70s these dialogues, which were really important and very strongly felt. So much so, I'll tell you a personal story. Then when Paolo Portuguesi decided to have the first Biennale, he erased Gregotti's Biennale and said, now we'll have the real first Biennale in 1980. And he invited postmodern architects. And I received a call from Manfredo Tafuri, who was a close friend at the time, and said to me, Peter, you cannot go in this exhibition. This is something we have to stay away from these things. Of course, that was silly not to do it, but I listened to Tafuri. I did go into the exhibition. It was a big success. And I always thought, why was I doing that? In any case, the period that I'm talking about comes to a closure in 1980 with the exhibition called Strada Novissima. And all these things you can find in books and magazines. In any case, they were all the postmodern architects. A few years later, in the United States, Philip Johnson, who was a kind of animator of young architects, he was really a person interested in supporting young architects, decided that he wanted to have a show at the Museum of Modern Art, a big architecture show that in fact put the end, as it were, to postmodernism. And what started in 72 ended in 1988 at MoMA. And Philip invited Rem Koolhaas, Frank Gehry, Wolf Prix, Danny Liebeskind, Peter Eisenman, Zaha Hadid, all of what could be considered the fringe postmodern architects. They weren't modern architects, they were something else. It was the generation after the Sterling, Rossi, Ungers, Venturi generation. In other words, these were people that were 10, 15 years younger. And it was really an important exhibition. It was called Deconstructivism. And it was about, it was a combination of Russian constructivists and French deconstruction philosophy. And as you know, all of the architects that participated were doing crazy form things. Not as crazy as going on today, but as crazy as the computers would let you do it. And that 88 show put an end, as it were, to the sort of kitsch, graphist postmodernism. And since 88, we have been struggling in the Western world to figure out what to do. There are many ideas, and one of the things that's important to understand is the takeover of the digital. And there's a professor in London by the name of Mario Carpo who has written 2 books on the digital. One called the From Alphabet to Algorithm was the first book, and the second was called The Second Digital Turn. And Mario, if you haven't read the books, they're really important to read because what he shows is how the digital has taken over architecture. My critique of the digital, and I've written it out someplace, I think Mario is a really good thinker, but the thing that is important to understand is what the digital has done, and especially the second digital, has gone from what one would call spline modeling to voxel modeling, and that is means that it can process data in enormous quantities as fast as small data. And so what architecture, which used to be that took time and was difficult, a resistant form of thinking, now could be easily done by anybody through big data, through the voxel platform. And what's happened to resistant architecture? And I think this is the really key, is that we can now produce architecture of any density, any complexity, any difficulty, which used to be stand against the easy consumption model of society. Architecture was a resistant form to consumption. And the problem with the digital now is that the digital no longer means that architecture is resistant. And that's a real problem for teachers and architects. And so where is Peter Eisenman today as a teacher? Well, I'm working right now on a book on Alberti, because I think Alberti is a precedent that's very important for young architects. And I think I wrote a book on Palladio. I'm writing a book now on Alberti, because I don't think any of the practicing architects today, and many of the teachers who go along with this and critics, have any idea of a resistance to consumption. And the one thing that architecture has always been able to do, great architecture, critical architecture, etc., was exhibit a resistance to consumption. When we are no longer able to do that, what is the role of architecture? So it's a real question, and it's one that the reason why I teach and I build and I think anyway. What I'm going to do is show a building now, which is important for me because it deals with the idea of precedent. And I think for young architects, you have to know precedents. You have to know Jim Sterling. You have to know Aldo Rossi. You need to know Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe. you need to know Borromini, and you need to know Palladio. You need to know Alberti, all the way back to Vitruvius. So history and theory, that is the ideas of those architects that I named, are really important to understand. And then there are more difficult architects like Carlo Rinaldi and Luigi Moretti and many others who have gone as a sort of a second level in architecture, but still very important. So I believe that it's important for every young architect not to just be a great designer, but to have a cultural understanding, not only of the West, but of the Middle East, of the East, etc. And what's happening in America today in our graduate schools is we have students from all over, from China, Japan, etc. One of my best students is a young Palestinian Arab who is now teaching in Hezbollah Bezalel, excuse me, not Hezbollah, Bezalel in Jerusalem. And architecture today, that's why I'm talking here, is really a global phenomenon. And yes, we all face global warming. We all face the problem of carbon form. We all face those things. But we're not going to be able to face them as architects if we don't know our discipline. It's not enough to know about global warming and carbon form, but what we need to know is how can architecture attack these things. So I'm going to show a project just recently completed in Milan, Italy, a housing project